Ever feel like we're living through one of those, like, before and after moments? Like, in the history books? It's like all the old rules are being thrown out the window. Like, are we really using the same map we were using just a couple of years ago? Well, there's an article, A Liminal Time,
Yeah.
and it really digs into this whole vibe of, well, being in a total transition. And liminal, by the way, just means being on the edge of something new, right?
Yeah, like a doorway between what was and what's next.
Exactly. And the author in this piece, they make a pretty bold statement right off the bat. They say the world order, the one we've known pretty much since World War II, it's falling apart. So, like, what does that even mean in plain English? World order sounds kind of ominous.
Right, like something out of a conspiracy theory. But it's actually pretty simple. Think of all the institutions, all the agreements, the whole system, really, that was put in place after World War II. The UN, how money works globally, even like the alliances that kept things relatively peaceful. Those were all part of that world order.
Makes sense.
And when the author talks about it crumbling, they're talking about those foundations cracking.
And they compare it to some pretty massive moments in history, like the Roman Empire collapsing.
Exactly. Those weren't just like regime changes, you know? They totally reshaped how societies function, how people lived, what they believed. The author seems to be hinting we might be in for something similarly huge. Kind of scary, but also kind of exciting when you think about it.
No kidding.
Yeah.
It really makes you appreciate that we even have jury systems, you know? Speaking of seeing things differently, the author brings up a kind of surprising example, France.
Ah, France. Always a good idea.
Right. So they talk about how different political groups in France, they see their own history totally differently.
It's wild, right?
Totally. So the right wing, they're all about continuity, like a straight line from the past to now. But the left, they focus on the revolution. To them, that's the starting point.
And those different views of the past, they totally shape how each side sees the future of France.
Okay, so how does a French history lesson help us understand, like, our everyday lives right here, right now?
It shows how the stories we tell ourselves about the past, those historical narratives, they're not just dusty old textbooks. They shape how we see the present and, more importantly, how we imagine the future. It's like if you're using an outdated map, you're going to have a tough time figuring out where you're going.
That makes a lot of sense. And this whole idea of narratives, it leads to a really interesting point the author makes about postmodernism. They say it might actually be a useful tool for, get this, traditionalists. Seems kind of strange, right?
Yeah, it's like those two things don't really go together. You've got postmodernism, all about breaking down old systems, challenging the usual way of thinking.
Exactly.
But the author, their point is that by doing that, by questioning everything, postmodernism might have accidentally created a space for traditional values to make a comeback.
So it's less about destroying tradition and more about clearing the ground for it, to rebuild.
That's a really good way to put it. Like, imagine a building that's been stripped bare down to its foundations. You could see that as a ruin, or you could see it as a chance to rebuild, maybe in a way that's more in line with those traditional values.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. But the author doesn't stop there. They start to talk about the future of democracy itself, and they even bring up Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. So for folks who don't spend their days reading think tank reports, could you break that down?
Absolutely. So the World Economic Forum, it's this big annual gathering, right? Super influential people, CEOs, politicians, big thinkers, you name it. They all get together to talk about the big problems facing the world. And the author, they use examples like the Trump and Biden presidencies to show how disillusioned people are getting with the way things work, with how politics function.
Like no matter who's in charge, nothing really changes.
Yeah, like there's this sense that the real power might lie somewhere else, maybe in these unelected groups like the WEF, for example.
Exactly. And that's where Schwab comes in.
Okay.
The author, they present Schwab and his ideas about the future, all this stuff about tech and moving away from how things have always been done, as like a direct response to these problems.
So is the author saying Schwab is the bad guy here? Not exactly. It's more like they're both looking at the same issues, same anxieties about the future, just coming up with very different answers.
So where does the author land then, if even they see Schwab and the WAF as trying to, deal with these huge global anxieties? What's their solution?
This is where things get really interesting. Because instead of going all in on technology like a lot of folks, the author actually calls for a return to something kind of old school faith and tradition.
Wow, okay, that's a hard left turn.
Yeah.
After talking about like collapsing world orders and the limits of postmodernism, going back to faith and tradition almost seems like, I don't know, trading our laptops for like carrier pigeons.
It's definitely a different approach.
Totally. So Help me understand, why does the author think this is the answer?
Well, they seem to be saying that the answers to today's problems, we're not going to find them in the same old systems that created those problems in the first place. They're pointing to something, I don't know, deeper, more fundamental, something that gives us a sense of meaning, of purpose, that goes beyond, like, the material world.
So are they saying we should all, like, reject technology and go live in the woods, become like modern-day monks or something?
Not necessarily. It's not about, like, literally turning back time.
Okay.
It's more about rediscovering those deeper values, that sense of connection, in a way that makes sense for today's world.
Okay, so it's not about ditching our iPhones, but it is about finding ways to, like, reconnect with those bigger ideas, those traditions, but in a 21st century way. But is that really enough? You know, I mean, we're talking about huge global changes, powerful institutions. Can faith and tradition really stand up to that?
That's the big question, right? And honestly, the author doesn't pretend to have all the answers. But what they do is challenge us, the readers, to really think about the role of faith and tradition in this crazy, uncertain future we're facing.
What do you mean challenge? Like, what are they asking us to do?
They're basically saying, okay, so we're at a crossroads, the old ways are falling apart, and the future is, well, it's unwritten. So what part are you going to play in writing it? And that goes for everyone, no matter what you believe. It's about realizing we have more agency than we think.
I like that. It's easy to feel powerless when everything's changing so fast. But the author's saying we're not just along for the ride, right? We can actually grab the wheel.
Exactly. And the way we steer, the direction we choose, that's going to be guided by our values, our beliefs, maybe even our faith, our traditions. The author's not giving us a map, but they're reminding us to, check our own internal compass.
That's actually really empowering. It's not about clinging to the past or blindly following some ideology. It's about actively creating the future based on what WE care about.
Exactly. It's about remembering that even though the world feels like it's spinning out of control sometimes, we still have the power to decide how we move within it.
I love that. And you know what else is interesting? For all the talk about things falling apart, the author seems strangely optimistic. They keep saying this liminal time. It's not just about things ending. It's like it's a chance for something totally new to begin.
Right. It's like, yeah, things are changing, maybe even falling apart, but that creates space for something else to emerge.
So instead of freaking out, we should be like, okay, what do we want to build?
Exactly. What kind of future do we want to be a part of creating? It's an invitation to step up, to take responsibility, to make choices that reflect what we believe in.
And it's not about, like, throwing out the past completely. It's about using those traditions, those values, as a guide.
It's about finding what's still relevant, what still speaks to us, and carrying that forward into the future.
This has been awesome. It's not every day you get to, like, really dig into these big questions about, where we're headed as a society.
Totally. It's been a pleasure.
So one last time for our listeners, any parting words of wisdom?
Don't be afraid to ask the big questions. Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. And most importantly, don't just let the future happen to you. Help shape it.
Boom. Mic drop. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive into a liminal time.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, folks.